Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Smart Cities Masterclass. This is a masterclass on urban data and governance, and I'm Catherine O'Regan. I'm the Executive Director of the Cities Leadership Institute. We've been running a range of programs as part of the Future Ready Smart Cities program of the Australian Federal Government. Earlier this year, we conducted a series of hands-on, day-long masterclasses across the country. And for the last few months, we've been running webinars such as this one, which is to complement those and do a deep dive into some of the key areas that I know many people out there in local government and in urban roles are challenged by when it comes to smart cities. One of the things that is our observation is that there's probably 4 cornerstones when it comes to smart cities. One is around community engagement and customer service, which we tackled last time in our webinar. There's also how do we actually build about a culture of innovation. It's all about being smart both within the organisation and within the community. And that webinar is to be scheduled later on this year. We also have one for all the finance people. No project gets started unless you can fund it. And how do you procure the services of some of the vendors that are in this particular area. So one of our webinars, which will be coming up on the 7th of December, is around funding, financing and procurement. But today it's really all about urban data and governance. And this is all about just trying to look at what kind of data can you collect, what should you actually collect, how do you manage that data, as well as how can you put some kind of framework around it so you've got the right governance mechanisms. One of the observations we've seen is that there's plenty of data around. It's about getting useful data and managing that data for a good purpose. So to help us today, we've actually got 2 very experienced presenters. We've got Dr. Neil Temperley, who's the Executive Product Manager for the Data 61, which is part of CSIRO, which is one of Australia's premier science agencies. And we also have Franz Anton. Now, I think Franz is coming all the way from Berlin today, but is actually located in Amsterdam and has been leading the way in many places when it comes to smart cities. So welcome to our presenters as well. For those who are online, I'll just run through the format today. We do have our 2 presenters. They'll spend about 20 minutes each just going through a particular presentation. If you think of questions, please use the sidebar and you can type your questions in and we'll be able to address those towards the end of the webinar today. Following each of the presentations from Neil and Franz, we'll actually have a bit of an interactive panel discussion and then we can come back to your specific questions. So the format is fairly free-flowing. But one that I'm sure will be stimulating for all of you. So to get us started, I'd like to then turn to Neil and Dr. Temperley, who, as I said, is part of CSIRO's little agency called Data 61. But Neil has been working with both the Transport Logistics Living Lab as well as Data 61 since 2011. One of the things that has been amazing is working with Neil on our masterclasses and having a very strong focus around how you manage your data, how can you get value from your data so that you can get a good platform for your particular city. It's also important to think about the vision and what you're trying to achieve, and the Living Lab work that Neil has done will be instrumental in looking at how we can deliver some things for local government today. So Neil, on that note, if I can hand over to you and you can start the presentation.
Great, thanks Catherine. It's a real pleasure to be here and I hope it's a really useful use of your time. I want to give you a little bit of an overview from my view on how to think about data in particular. Just, oops. Just advancing my slideshow here. Okay, good. So how do we think about future cities and data in particular? Let me just I love putting this up because I think it reminds us in today's challenging age of the very biggest picture. And while we often feel like we can't impact the very biggest picture, I think it's an act of maturity to start thinking about it. And so these are key issues in future cities from my view. The challenge of sustainability, the challenge of being resilient, and of course we want our city to be great places to be and to live. And the sustainable one is, it's environmental, and we all understand that. It's economic in the true sustainable sense of an economy that can last a long time, not something that's just expanding in a finite world. But also social. So the UN have a great sort of definition of sustainability that includes social justice and all those other things that we also want to achieve, and equality and so forth. So I'll just touch on that because I think these are the big picture things that we should always have in the back of our mind. And so many of our activities are not ones that are truly ones that are going to last, and we need to start recognizing that and working towards things that last. Otherwise our children are going to have huge challenges, bigger than we already forecast. If we think about infrastructure for a minute, this is kind of my simplistic view of an ideal world of how you think about infrastructure. You'd start with anticipating the need, you predict the kind of services you want your infrastructure to support, and so in a bicycle path example, you want to have a bicycle path, you're going to think about the commuters who might use it, you might think about someone might hire bikes for tourists to use your path, you design it, where it's going to go, its capacity, its width and so forth. You set aside some resources. You may not have the money right now, but you're going to reserve the corridor through the parkland or through the back streets, whatever it's going to be. Then, of course, you build it, and often it's others providing the services. Other people provide the bikes, the hire, people come in and make use of your infrastructure. And I'd like us to start thinking about data and information in the same kind of way. So in this talk, I'll be talking about how to think about data and information from that perspective of planning, designing, and so forth. And so this is my view of how to do it. At the top in this diagram, it's not government at the top and it's not citizens at the bottom. It's actually a goal at the top, and it's ideally a citizen-focused goal. And down near the bottom somewhere, on the red there, we have the kind of what we call the data and the information infrastructure, which is a couple of things. It's our information foundations, that's kind of the data, the analytics, the data flows, but it's also the physical stuff which you're familiar with, you know, the NBN, the sensors and all of that. But going back up to the top, if we take a top-down approach, what are we trying to achieve in our city? So these are your city goals can fit up here. These might be some environmental indicators, it might be services that you want to do for your citizens. I would really recommend you take it to the next step and turn these into use case scenarios. And quite a few cities have done this. Adelaide have a nice scenario of the ideal experience for their citizen. And I would recommend that for you as well, to think about, you know, a day in the life of a particular person in this future, how they interact with technologies, how they might interact with your city services, all the great things your city is going to provide for them and to help them along the way. And in normal design thinking, you're going to turn those scenarios into requirements. So you work your way down this pyramid, and next comes the solutions and the services. And in today's world, that's often an app, and it's often provided by someone else. But it's this bit that's the bit that's often missing in our thinking. Well, actually, a lot of those early steps are missing in our thinking often, but it's this bit that's really fundamental, this data and information infrastructure that supports that solution and service and ultimately supports our goals. And often we don't put enough thought into the infrastructure bit, and as a consequence, well, I'll show you some examples later of what the consequence is, but it's usually fragmentation and things not working well at all. And of course, let's not forget our policies and regulations and standards that set up the whole environment to make the whole thing happen. So let's just think of some top-down examples. You might have some goals like this. You might want to have more citizen participation. Why wouldn't you? You want safety at night time, might be important for your area. Perhaps neutral carbon emissions, great. Improved aged care services. Whatever these goals are, they kind of sit at the top of this thinking, and you can turn those into scenarios of what that future experience might look like. And then when you get down to that information layer or that information infrastructure layer, it turns into, well, what kind of data are we going to collect? Where's it get, when do we collect it? Where does it get stored? And then what kind of analytics? Because often the data itself is kind of too crude, and you're going to do some smarts on top of that data that ultimately underpin the services that you want to provide. But there is an alternative approach, and when we talk about open source, that is the classic alternative approach, which is, in my view, a kind of a bottom-up approach. And I'm not dissing the bottom-up approach of open source. Quite the opposite. It's very valuable, and and rightly so. It's proved great value around the world, and we're big advocates of open source as well. But it is more of a bottom-up approach, and it's a little bit of the serendipity approach of saying, well, what data have we got? Let's release that data. It's a bit like putting fertilizer on an open field. You're not sure exactly what's going to grow, but you throw out the open data, and lo and behold, you'll find people create apps and do really clever things with it, and everyone gets pleasantly surprised at how wonderful clever people and what wonderful things clever people do with that data to make new apps. But it is a kind of also a strategic gamble, and I guess over time you want to get better at that and understand which data sets have the most value and learn how to prioritize those data sets. But my point is that the open data is a bit more of a bottom-up approach. You're not too sure exactly what the outcomes are going to be, but you know they're going to be, you're opening up the pathway for good outcomes to occur. So in the end, with this kind of thinking, I would recommend doing both. Yes, of course, let's do our open data, but also let's not forget to think really carefully about the goals for your city and the implications that has as you work down through the diagram. Think of those goals and think of the implications and how that pans out to be what's the kind of data and information infrastructure that's going to support my goals for my city. I showed that table showing the bike path example. Well, let's look at the data version of that. Yes, the same things are on the left. We want to anticipate the need. We want to predict the services our infrastructure is going to support. On the right, it's now city goals. City is a personalized service. The whole idea that we coined at Data 61, that your city is actually now providing with personalized services. So your interaction with your city feels like a personalized experience. Even though you're using public transport, you're feeling like you're being really cared for as in a personal way. That's a vision, and we know how to work backwards from those kind of visions to the kind of data that's going to be needed to collected and stored and analyzed to support those kind of visions. You do the design bit, which is that data, the analytics, the information flows, the communications, who has to talk with what and where does the data flow, but also issues like who owns the data, the custodianship, the governance, who should have access, who shouldn't, privacy issues, are we dealing with data that's particularly sensitive here, how are we going to manage that? And then the other steps follow on, but down near the bottom somewhere you've got your apps at the end. Unfortunately, in the Australian context, and I suspect around the world, often we're kind of starting at step 4 and 5. We've kind of got some data, we might release it and some apps occur, or we may not have the data, but someone comes along and says, hey, look, I've got a great idea for an app. You say, okay, go away and do it, but there's no consideration with the value of that data, and often the data gets tied up in a walled garden, or it's just not accessed and you just don't get the maximum value. You definitely wouldn't build your bike path by saying, okay, here's some land, you know, I hope the bike hire people will build a path. You know, that's really unlikely in these kind of scenarios. You can do a bit better by thinking about it and designing it and get the fundamentals right. You don't have to build a lot, you just want to get the fundamentals right. I talked about the kind of chaos that can occur if you don't think about this integration, and this is the kind of thing we see commonly today. Certainly in Australia, perhaps less in some other places. Maybe Franz Anton can point to places where it's working really well. But if apps kind of grow up topsy-turvy, you end up with a topsy-turvy non-integrated approach, and it really limits your ability to meet those top goals. You're just blocked at every turn because things just don't work together smoothly. Just a little bit of education about data. We talked about different kinds of data. I talked about designing data and open data, and we talked about privacy a little bit. This is a nice diagram that captures a few of those key concepts. On the left here, we talk about closed data or very private or sensitive data. there is data you may need to collect that supports your goals that has a high lot of sensitivity, in which case, again, you want to think about those things in advance and not get caught out by that, and plan for it and understand how you're going to deal with that. There's data in a kind of middle ground between, oh, let's go to the open side, I guess. On the open side, there's data that's freely open, and there's no privacy concerns, so that's your open data. And in the middle, there's kind of shared data, or sometimes people call it club data, where just a club of people who are authorized, who you trust, have access to it. A club of friends, if you like. And when we talk about data, we need to understand that data does fit into these different categories and be aware in advance of how we're going to deal with any sensitivity and privacy issues. So it's another good reason to think about these things in advance and not get caught out with it further down the track. Future-proofing. Is future-proofing possible? I would say from a technology perspective, it's pretty much impossible to guess where technology is going to go. But there are areas where we can be fairly future-proof, I believe, and that's when we take it back to the very fundamentals of what it means to be a human. So when you think of citizen services, or we think of, oh, let's just look at this diagram for a second. Maslow's hierarchy is an example of something that doesn't really change with technology. So Maslow was a guy who said, look, these are the fundamental needs. Down the bottom, you've got your basic need of food and shelter. After that, you're concerned about safety, love and belonging, and if you get to the top, you're in a great place, you're a self-actualized person. But this is, my point of the diagram is it's a focus on the person. It's a focus on the citizen, if you like. And I believe that if we take that approach, and if you put your user or your citizen at the top of your thinking, and think of the services and the experiences that you want to give them, those things won't change very fast. A really good experience is a good experience regardless of the technology. Sometimes the technology just essentially is an aid to that process and can make it even better. But if you feel like you've had a great customer service, you can get that in a low technology environment or a high technology environment. So in my view, the ideal analysis is to start with that user-centric vision, work to those scenarios, think about the implications for your design, and proceed with your great smart city projects. I've got a little bit of time, so I'm working to my time pretty well. I think I wanted to turn this into a bit of an example. Mobility, if you like, by design. So this is, the mobility or transport for people by design, not by chance. City is a personalized service, so trying to make it a personalized feel. And I thought I'd just try and talk you through some scenarios and say, okay, is this something that we believe in is a great outcome for a citizen? So I wanted to talk about what it feels like to have a concierge kind of experience. And if you've been to a very flash restaurant, you should get exactly that. You're usually greeted at the door and they look after you. Sorry, sir, your table's not ready. We really apologize, but look, we'll go to the bar. We'll give you a free drink while you're waiting, because your service is we're really sad that we couldn't have your table ready quite on time, but we'll look after you. And when your table is ready, of course, they come and grab you and they guide you to the table. They don't leave it to your own devices. You're not at McDonald's, you're in the luxury service. They guide you to the table and they look after you and they give you that fully fledged VIP kind of experience. Now, I think that sets a great goal for a customer experience that perhaps you can translate into other kinds of users or customers of your city. So if you think of a courier, the ideal experience is you have a virtual concierge, essentially speaking in the courier's ear, and we know how to do that kind of thing with apps. You see it with where Siri and some of these things like Siri and Cortana and those other kind of smart services, Google, with their device sitting in your home with their advertising. These are all heading in that direction of your artificial intelligence assistant who's going to guide you and help you. And so in the example of a courier, yes, of course, you want your system to guide them through the city, so that we kind of see that with our mapping services, but also guide them probably to a pre-booked parking space. So loading zones in the future makes very good sense to have them bookable and go straight to the loading zone, so there's no cruising around looking for a place to stop. Also, even even in a perhaps a bit more futuristic, even coordinating the meeting if they have to get their goods signed off, even coordinating that aspect of the meeting and making sure that that's going to occur and that the delivery goes as smoothly as possible, and working behind the scenes to make that happen on the behalf of the courier. So the ideal experience for the courier is to get in there, deliver the parcel, and get out onto the next job. If we think of an outpatient travelling by public transport, their goal is not to travel on the system, their goal is to make their doctor's appointment, and the city is going to help them meet their goals. So the virtual assistant behind the scenes books all the transport, confirms the booking with the doctor, make sure that's all happening behind the scenes, guides our traveller onto the train, onto the bus. Perhaps the train's running a bit late, and the bus knows now, because it's a very good system and it's designed around the customer, the bus knows that there's 20 people on that train that want to catch it. So the bus makes a conscious decision to delay itself and wait a little bit longer, and on the balance of knowing what all the passengers want to achieve, makes that decision, and so our patient doesn't miss the bus, makes the connection, and gets to the doctor on time. And in the whole process, you're taking away all the decision stress from the traveller, and you're essentially giving them the information they need when they need it, without them having to be an expert on how to navigate the vagaries of a particular transport system or a particular city that they happen to be in. So there's some examples of vision, of future vision of mobility, and you can put those at the top. There's your use cases, and you can turn those into requirements for, well, how do we orchestrate that a bus knows about the people that want to catch it, and how does the bus make a sensible decision about whether to be delay itself or not, and how does it share that decision with others, and how do others feel about that? Maybe other people on the bus would say, no, look, it's really important. We've got just as important meetings, and we can't afford to be delayed. In which case, the bus might make a different decision. But it's that looking after the traveller experience that you're seeking to gain, where the traveller feels like they're being heard and they're getting the best possible service within the limits of your city. So just in summary, this is how I'd like us to always think about our data from that top down, where the goal is at the top and the person is at the top, down to use case scenarios, down to the data information infrastructure. And I think this is the data by design, the doing it by design approach, and it's really important to try and nail that infrastructure bit as early as we can, because if you get that right, you'll support a whole heap of future apps and things that others will develop. That in those scenarios, you could have several apps all sharing the same basic data infrastructure. That means they can provide variations on the theme or their own flavor of the same service. And I think that's about my right timing for this talk. So thank you very much. I hope that was entertaining and interesting and worth your time.
Thank you. Thank you, Neil. And what I think is very interesting there is that combination of your top-down, which seems to be that more organized approach, and your bottom-up, which is almost like the organic approach. And it almost becomes embedded in both of those, an opportunity of discovery. Sometimes, and I've seen cities do this before, is that they start out on a journey collecting data, and yet that data could actually reveal other information, which is a bit of a surprise, but can help solve another city's problems. Is that sort of how you've seen it also work through?
Yeah, the open data one is along that lines of, we collect data, we release it, and we get this great surprise, this very pleasant surprise that people have added value to it in some way. And so the open data approach is always valid, and it's been proven over and over again what great outcomes it can bring. But we should never forget that when you've got the opportunity and you're thinking from the start, just do it by design. Don't rely on pleasant surprises. Try and anticipate, and plan for it, and then you won't get these broken services. We have a lot of broken services that provide a service that's kind of useful, but not nearly meeting the potential that it could. And this is a great opportunity. I don't know that anyone in the world, perhaps Franz Antons can tell us, but has really got this nailed well. we see examples, and everybody wants to do it. Everybody wants to do mobility in a service and some of these great ideas, but they really presuppose a level of integration, a level of data sharing underneath them that often doesn't exist.
Yeah, when a city is looking at, just going to your point around open data, and I think there's always a little bit of hesitancy in just putting a whole lot of data out there. Is there some sort of principles that you think are worthwhile considering if a city was saying, well, open data, it could actually be important because we want to have collective thought around solving particular problems. I've seen cities where they start with, tree data. Other times it's about the garbage collection. Other times it's around transport. Do you sort of have a rule of thumb as to where a city may be best placed to start?
I would love to have a great rule of thumb, and I don't think I'm the best person to ask that question. But I think it's a really, really good question. I think it's an opportunity in Australia to actually, if we could be sharing that information with the cities who have got the most value, be able to look at different data sets and say, look, we really got a lot of value out of that tree data, surprising value, to help councils prioritise. Because I'm sure they've all got lots of data sets under their desks and in various places, and prioritising, I'm sure, is very challenging, and I wouldn't pretend to be an expert on who's got the most value out of the data, out of which data sets.
I'm wondering whether it comes back to your point around vision. If you're clear on your vision and what the problem you're trying to solve, then maybe that starts to be a bit of a starting point, and there's almost like a risk cost analysis that can then go, well, there's a lot of data there, but that's going to be too much of a risk or too costly. Then you start to filter it through some other stage gate decisions from that decision making, that vision starting point. We might have we might be able to focus on that.
Fran's answer, I'm sure, can really give much better examples than I. But of course, if you do it working from a design perspective, you know exactly what data you want to collect and why you're collecting it. So that's and if you have existing data sets, you know exactly how you want to use them. But you may have data, you may not have the data yet, and you may say, look, to support this service, we will need to be collecting this kind of data. We'll start with collecting it this way, but further down the track, we might use this other technique. And so you can start road mapping because you know what data you want to collect and where you want it available. And also the analytics on top of that is also part of that planning.
Yeah. Now that sounds good. Sounds good. So, look, I think that's a lovely segue, Neil, and thank you for your time and your insights there. And I believe Franz Anton is good to go. Some of the technology there in Berlin may have been a bit of a challenge, but we'll start to progress and move to the next presenter. So Franz has been working on smart cities, I think, for a long time. I sometimes think it goes right back into the early 2000s, if not before. He really is an expert in looking at different and novel ways to bring about new products, new appliances, new services to cities. And, Franz, I love the way you always talk about live, work and play pleasantly and about happy cities. We often use the term livable, but it almost goes back to Neil's Maslow's hierarchy there. If we're in a good, happy, safe place, we have that self-actualization. But I know have been doing a lot of work, not just in Europe, but across the world. You have had the chance to come out to Australia on several occasions, so you know some of our specific challenges. So you have a wealth of insights into best practice and next practices. So over to you to share some of those with us today.
Okay, thanks, Catherine. I hope the PowerPoint is working now. Can you see the first page with the canal houses?
Yes.
Okie dokie. So what I'd like to do in the next 20 minutes is to give you a bit of an insight of what we've been doing in Amsterdam Smart City for the last 10 years and focusing on data and how data may help to improve the livability of our citizens. Just before I start off, maybe it's good to give a bit on the governance structure of Amsterdam Smart City. It's a not-for-profit open innovation platform on arm's length of the government. So we can do a lot of pilots and trials without having it immediate political consequences. But it's also it has also the possibility to attract money that doesn't need to go through a huge bit of procurement. So the characteristics of Amsterdam Smart City is, as I mentioned, it's an open innovation platform based on open source and open data. And I think one of the important things when you start off to share data is that you have a cross-silo approach and make sure that you share the data not only with your citizens but also within departments and later on also with the private sector. Our strategic partners are some of the bigger companies in the Netherlands, which are at the right bottom, the government, and it's not only the Amsterdam city government, but basically all local governments in the Amsterdam metropolitan area. Then on the top left we have the citizens engagement organizations. Now I'm losing my.
Yeah, Franz, I'm going to flip back to my holding screen, but if you can keep going, your screen seems to have gone black again. But if you can still work through, we'll do our best to follow you.
Yeah, okay. I'll have to go back to my presentation. I'm sorry about that. And we have the University of Applied Sciences involved as well. And both for the research doing up front, but also doing the research later on. So actually we can actually measure what we do. As a open innovation platform, what we do is basically connect people who have questions, organizations that have questions, and match them with all kind of suppliers of technology solutions, but also human solutions on the human scale. Then it's for us it's a task to accelerate, to make sure that everything is going into place and that people are really that projects are really happening. And then last but not least, and that's the most difficult part, which is the scaling of the projects. The data innovation in Amsterdam, it's actually not about the technology, but it's about the enabling smart citizens. So one of the examples we have in Amsterdam now is that people that are disabled, and usually they were collected by special vehicles to get them to daycare. Nowadays, people who have the ability and have the possibility to read an app, that they can actually go on public transport by themselves, and as long as the parents know where they are, they're happy, and that that their child basically is not in danger and is taken good care of. The data innovation, we did it on an external part. We hired a few people to make sure that it's all the data are put in a data exchange, and the City of Amsterdam took care of a data city portal and a data lab. From that on, we used the City of Amsterdam and the Chief Technology Office to going into action and to make sure that all projects are running both within the city and outside of the city. And Amsterdam Smart City is basically running the projects outside of the city. We have a lot of data sets. We've made them available for to the public and to all kind of companies, because we believe that the collaboration between the public and private sector and the collaboration with the citizens will actually increase the livability of the city. And we have all kind of themes of those data sets. It's about governance, it's about population, it's about the economics, the port, the education, youth and diversity, energy, geography, environment and water, public safety, and the physical space. And in the past, when we started off as Amsterdam Smart City, we mainly focused on how can we reduce CO2 emission, or how can we reduce congestion. But we're shifting from that perspective now more towards a social inclusion approach. And we also try to cover poverty issues and domestic violence issues. As I mentioned in the past, it was focusing on how could you reduce, say, for example, 30 minutes congestion, but we forgot about the people that don't even have the possibility to buy a car, and they don't need to worry about congestion. So that's the focus we're having now, especially in the social domain. We're trying to focus on, and we need the open data. And what we did in the past is organizing a competition called Apps for Amsterdam. So we made the data available, and we asked the citizens and small and medium enterprises to develop apps that would benefit the citizens. And I think one of the best apps that I've seen from a social perspective is a gentleman that who is disabled and is in a wheelchair, and he managed to develop an app that would tell him, based on the open data, where there would be toilets available that have accessibility for disabled people. Another person that developed an app was basically, he put on a map all the playgrounds for children with all the facilities and all the safeties and all kind of other features. And that was based on the data he gathered himself, but also the data that was provided by the City of Amsterdam. The City of Amsterdam itself developed quite a few apps. So we have the Energy Atlas. So it's basically a platform where demand and supply will meet of sustainable energy. Another app is called Vistory, where the city has made a lot of data available from the archives, and you can actually walk through town and look on your phone how the city looked like 100 or 200 years ago. Another app that's very popular under the Amsterdam citizens is the Open Spending app that was developed by the City of Amsterdam, where you can actually see a real-time profit and loss and a real-time balance sheet of the City of Amsterdam. And another app that was developed in collaboration with all the schools, that there's 10,000 schools on the in an app available, where basically parents and kids can see how a school is performing and make a choice based on that information. There's the other development we realize is that data don't need to be open all the time, but you want to have them open when they are actually when there's an incident or where there's an emergency. And we had to find out that in a really tough way, and that was because one of the firemen was stabbed when he got into a fire in a block where there was a fire. And by evaluating that incident, the policeman said, you should have known that in this particular apartment there's a guy living with mental disability, and he has attacked us before. So for emergencies, we now upload a lot of data so that all emergency services can have a look at those data and can use those data. The other thing is that in the port, there's a lot of the port of Amsterdam. There's a lot of factories which store chemicals, and usually you don't want to share your information on what you have on your property with other companies in the area. But when there's a fire, you definitely want to know what's at your neighbor's property, so that the fireman can actually handle very accurate and to protect your property when there's fire at the neighborhood. Another thing is what we did is opening up the data with the public, but also search the collaboration and the partnership with Google and TomTom. What we figured out is that the information gathered by devices like Google Maps and TomTom is much more accurate than the information that's gathered by cameras or with loops and wiring in the roads. And based on that experiment now, we forecast that we can have a saving of about 12 million euros per year on cameras and by using those open data. Another project, what we did is to combine all type of data, also from Google, TomTom, the open data from the city of Amsterdam, and that is to predict on big data if there's a parking space available within the city center. As we figured out that driving around looking for a parking space is the biggest source of CO2 pollution within the city of Amsterdam. Why do we want to use open data? We want to have a transparent city, we want to have an efficient city, and we want to have an innovative city. And we're shifting now basically from open data only to data innovation. We want to have the transparent city by making the internal data as visual as possible. I think, or we think that we can have an efficient city as long as we share the data, and as long as you open up your data and you innovate with data and on data, you can have an innovative city that's prepared for the future. Excuse me. There's also a lot of apps developed by third parties. So, for example, that within certain neighborhoods they developed an app that if something's wrong, then there will be an alert to certain people within that neighborhood. But it also, by the contribution of Amsterdam, they also put in now actively what kind of permits have been granted by the local government. So basically the environment within that neighborhood can have a look on what permits have been granted to people. We figure out that a lot of small and medium enterprises within the city of Amsterdam are disappearing because of all the web purchases. So what we're trying to do now, together with a group of small and medium enterprises, to have a real-time stock information of a particular shop on the website. So instead of that somebody goes online and buys stuff, then they can actually go into the shop and look at the articles they want to purchase and they can get it from the small and medium enterprise, so supporting their neighborhood as well. And there's also a demand and supply now on recycle goods. So if you have old stuff that you want to get rid of, don't put it to the with the waste, but just put it online, and it's a kind of eBay or marketplace, but only for recyclables materials. So not actually goods, but more the materials that are in those goods. That's basically it from my point. My apologies that the slides were not working. That makes it a little bit more difficult for me to talk as well. But hopefully you get the hang of it, and hopefully the Q&A session is a bit more interesting.
Thank you, Frans Anton, and thank you everybody for your patience there. It is one of the challenges where we have different people in different locations in the world, but we do try and get different cities' experiences, so that's useful. Frans Anton, I want to maybe reflect back on some of the conversations we were having there with Neil, and the way that Amsterdam seems to have got the data in the open environment and had these apps. You know, I found it amazing, whether it's for the disabled, the playground, or the schools. Did the city go about that in a structured way, or did they simply put out a large amount of data and waited to see what would happen? Or did you use incentives? Did you segment it and ask for certain, or it's something on schools as opposed to something on waste? Did you really manage it, or just simply sort of use that serendipity and see what happens?
Yeah, so basically we opened up that data, we made that available, and we basically invited people over by a competition called Apps for Amsterdam, so that they can actually develop applications based on that open data. And we also ask private companies now to open up the data and put that in the Amsterdam data set. And the first ones to open up their data were mobile phone companies, but now you see also a lot of restaurants and cafes opening up their data because they think they can attract new clientele if they provide that data.
Yeah, so and thinking about advice that you would possibly then give to a city as to where to start with opening up that data. You're actually thinking, that there's data that the city may have, and there's data that the private sector might have. Is there something that the city should think about if they were going to open up some specific data sets? Where could they start?
If cities just opening up their data sets in between two departments, for example, that's a good test, and then you can see where the mistakes could be, but then it still stays internally. But if you want to go really to the out in the open, then you can possibly start with the number of visitors at the desk of the city hall who will get passports or any kind of other permits, and just do it step by step by step, because if you put all the data on the street at once, then it's a road for disaster. So do it step by step and start with non-privacy sensitive data.
Yeah, because it can feel overwhelming when it comes to these sorts of things. And one of the recent things Cities Leadership did was we were traveling through the west coast of the US, and we were asking different cities these exact same questions. And there were cities that seemed to be a lot more confident and just seemed to put a range of data sets out into the public domain, and others had a far more measured and structured approach. And I'm not sure if one's better than another. It might just still be coming down to that confidence factor. Is that sort of where your thinking is, Frans?
Yeah, it's also about confidence, but it's also a change in mindset. What you see with a lot of people working for city governments, they're just afraid to open up the data because they're afraid that a lot of things can go wrong with them. Yes, of course, there will things go wrong with when you're opening up data, but just be confident. And unfortunately, the other thing has happened in Amsterdam as well, that two guys from the public transportation division didn't want to open up the data because they said it was too confidential, etc. But once we figured out and had opened up the data, we figured out that these guys were doing a very, very bad job, and we just have to sack them to open up that data. So sometimes you have to take brave measures, and it's quite often that people don't want to open up their data because they want to hide something, and that's what you have to overcome, and that needs some bold measurements and some courage.
Yeah, and I think that sort of is a good point, because and we might sort of open up to more of a panel discussion on this one, is that it's a cultural change, it's a mindset change. And Neil, I know that you are also, I think, touching on this, is that we're not just doing things differently, we have to think about things differently. And maybe, you know, Franz, if you reflect on some of the work I know you've done with different cities, even in Australia, do you think the biggest barrier to some of this opening up of data is that fear? You know, we keep talking about, you know, innovation is, we shouldn't be afraid of failure, we should embrace failure. Is that still, you know, looming large in people's minds, that, you know, we need it, we're too scared because we don't want to fail?
Yeah, and the other important argument, I think, is trust. People do not trust the other departments. People do not trust the outside world. And I think if you trust each other a little bit more within the public sector, but also between the private and the public sector, I think that can accelerate the data innovation that will benefit the citizens in the end.
Yeah, yeah, and Neil, I think from your perspective, you're talking about a citizen-focused goal, and getting trust with those citizens, and trust in that you have the skills to open that data. Do you see that as something that is changing with the people that you're talking to? Are we getting to a place where there is more trust in ourselves and trust in others?
Yeah, definitely. What I see that especially the younger generation is getting much more confident by using data, and also opening up the data, because that's what these youngsters are doing day to day. They're giving out so much data on Facebook, on Instagram, and they benefit from it. And if you take that kind of attitude towards a working environment, then they will see that opening up data will benefit them as well, and the organization in the end. But I definitely see a little bit of leaning towards the good end, that people are willing to share their data, both in the public sector and the private sector.
Neil, do you have a comment? Because, you know, Franz is raising a point there about trade-offs. You know, we do sometimes feel that we can trade off some of our privacy because we see some of that benefit, and being, you know, confident to do that. That is a whole shift, I think, in terms of the sort of current culture, where you often have cities that know everything and will selectively give information out, but there's actually a thirst for information in the community, and they're trading off in a very different environment that maybe the city government is trading off. Do you have sort of insights and thoughts on that sort of trade-off paradigm?
I think, you know, to back up what Franz said, there is a generational change here. So we see the younger generations being almost reckless sometimes with their private information, and maybe we'll you know, maybe as we grow experience, maybe there'll be a sort of a middle ground. But at the end of the day, there is a trade-off. I talked about some mobility examples, and it's a really good example of a trade-off, because if a city has the capability to provide me with a great mobility experience, I've got to tell the city a lot about my plans for the day, so we can orchestrate and help orchestrate behind the scenes my travel, and maybe even my meeting with my doctor or something. And so that's giving up a lot of private information. So if that's one of the visions of a future customer service, we need to tackle that head on, not only from terms of how do we protect this information from getting in the wrong hands, but also gaining the trust of the citizen in the first place to have permission to deal with information in the first place.
Yeah, and I think it's really the world upside down, that people are willing to share a lot of information with the outside world, but they don't want to share their information with one organization in life that should be trusted, which is government. And that's a long way to go. Even here in the Netherlands and in Europe, it's still a long way to go. But it's just crazy that people are willing to share all their kind of credit card information, etc., with third parties. But the one party that they should trust from the beginning, they're not willing to share, and that's a cultural change as well, both from the public sector itself and the citizens.
Yeah, and I think there has been a shift, and we're sort of on that journey. And one area that we haven't quite touched on, I think, is that ongoing management of data. If you actually put a whole lot of information out into the public domain, and then you have an app that's developed as a result of that, you know, who owns that data? Where does that data end up? You know, Franz, I'm kind of thinking, are there some examples? They might be actually bad examples that, you know, where it hasn't worked well, where, you know, data seems to have ended up in places that you didn't expect, and it may not have had the best result, or data actually was really leveraged to produce something positive. If there's sort of an ongoing use of data, how can you manage it, or manage it and govern it, or do you simply have to let go?
You do not simply have to let go, but you have to give it a try, and that's what I was mentioning earlier on. Just try to open up your data that are non-privacy sensitive. And yes, we've had a hack, and certainly all kind of people who got social benefit, they didn't get 800, but they get 80,000 all, and that was just because of a simple hack. But we've learned from that hack. We found the people that did it, and it's a bit of trial and error. But as soon as you try to hide those mistakes and hide those hacks, then I think you're in a much more difficult situation.
Yeah. Neil, do you have any thoughts there?
No, I think you pretty well covered it. I think trust is a major issue. It was interesting hearing Tel Aviv talk recently, and they said that they were getting a bit of pushback from their citizens. The citizens felt that the government wanted lots of data and they weren't getting much for it. So they created a citizen card where in getting the card, you were acknowledging that you're giving up some private data. And they had some fun things in there, like what kind of pet did you have and when's the pet's birthday. And in return, they were giving them free yoga lessons. They would push, you know, happy birthday to your dog, you know, the cheap grooming or something, you know, some fun things as well. But that was their approach to tackle some of the sensitivity issues, was to really try and help citizens feel like they're getting something back in return for giving up some of the more privacy concerning data.
Yeah, that's one of the things we did. We do with big events. We, especially where there's a lot of tourists around, we'll ask them 30 seconds of their time to log on to the Wi-Fi and to give some of their details that we can never lead back to one particular person, and they will get free Wi-Fi for that. So, and then suddenly people are willing to share the data a bit better. And it's also, if you either get money for it or you get nice things like Neil was mentioning, like free yoga lessons, then people are much more willing to share some of their data. And it's a mental thing. They have to get over that mental blockage.
Yeah, yeah.
And
okay,
could I give another just very
yes.
practical example of where there's collaboration between banks and the City of Amsterdam? We made an agreement with one bank, and they will basically send us a message then if somebody hasn't paid his rent 3 months in a row, that the City of Amsterdam will get a signal and can go and talk to these people to see if they can solve the problem. And that's a big improvement, because in the past the City of Amsterdam only got involved when people were already kicked out of their houses. And that's now both from the tenant that are willing to share that information, the bank is sharing that information, and the City of Amsterdam is sharing that information, which will in the end save the City of Amsterdam a lot of money, and it's much better for the well-being of the tenant that can't pay his rent, because he gets help in a much earlier stage of his problem.
Yeah, okay, that sounds good. And it's always good to sort of give those clear examples. I am conscious of time, and want to thank everybody for being online today, and thank you to Neil and Frans Anton. In terms of summing up, there's a couple of points that really stick in my mind, and that's when you're managing data or looking at your data strategy, then you do need to understand and have a clear vision, which is around citizen focused, and you can think about and anticipate some of those future needs of the citizens. And then I come to almost like 3 T's. It's about thinking about trust and generating trust, to think about how you do those trade-offs. I think there's some great examples there where you can actually get people to provide data, use data, but they need to get a benefit in turn into that trade-off. But also try something, have the confidence and the capability to try something, and then you'll definitely learn and build that confidence and capability as you go. So data I've found is almost like at the, as we said at the beginning, the heart of being a smart city, how you use data, how you manage data, how you govern data, and it really can open up many minds and many services and cities to being along the Smart Cities journey. So on behalf of the Cities Leadership Institute, I just really want to say thank you everybody this morning. We do have one more webinar coming up on the 7th of December, and that's for all the financing and funding components. But thanks again, and I hope to talk to you again soon.
Good. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Frans.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Cara. Thank you, Neil. Hope to see you all in person soon.